At exactly 5 in the morning on May 10, 2024, Russian armored vehicles crossed the border into Ukraine's Kharkiv region under the cover of darkness. Guided aerial bombs fell on Ukrainian defense lines near the town of Vovchansk. Artillery fire erupted along positions that Ukrainian soldiers had held for nearly 2 years. Within hours, President Vladimir Zelensky was standing before cameras in Kyiv confirming the worst. Russia had launched a new offensive in Kharkiv. He called the fighting fierce. He called the situation critical. And he called on Western allies to send weapons faster. But what happened next, and what is happening right now in 2026, reveals a pattern so deliberate, so calculated, and so dangerous that the full weight of it has yet to sink in for NATO capitals, still searching for an answer they do not have. Because Putin has not simply launched another attack, he has sprung a trap. And Kharkiv is the bait. The city of Kharkiv sits less than 30 kilometers from the Russian border. It is Ukraine's second largest city, home to more than 1 million people before the war. In the first days of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russian forces tried to take it. They failed. Ukrainian defenders pushed them back. By September 2022, Ukraine launched one of the most stunning counteroffensives of the entire war, reclaiming vast swaths of Kharkiv Oblast in days. Russian forces fled so fast, they left tanks, ammunition, and equipment behind. It was the moment Ukraine's allies believed the tide had turned permanently. They were wrong. By late 2023, Russian military commanders had rebuilt, restructured, and retrained. They created a new military formation specifically for the Northeastern Front, calling it the North Troop Grouping. Its mission was not simply to hold territory. Its mission was to stretch Ukraine's defensive resources, to force Kyiv to pull soldiers from other critical fronts, and to establish what Russian commanders began calling a security belt or buffer zone inside Ukrainian territory. On December 28, 2025, Putin stood before his top military commanders and told them, without hesitation, that Russian forces were creating a security belt in the border areas of Sumy, Kharkiv, and Dnipropetrovsk regions at good speed. He praised the high tempo of the offensive. He declared that Russia's interest in any Ukrainian withdrawal from occupied territories had been reduced to zero. He was not describing a defensive maneuver, he was describing a conquest dressed in the language of protection. Russia's top general, Valery Gerasimov, made the strategy explicit. He visited the command post of the North Grouping and announced that Putin had personally ordered an expansion of the buffer zone operation inside Kharkiv and Sumy regions throughout 2026. Gerasimov claimed Russian forces had already seized approximately 950 square kilometers and 32 settlements in those two regions alone. Ukrainian President Zelensky called Moscow's plans for Kharkiv and Sumy mad. He vowed they would be resisted. But the numbers on the battlefield told a different story about how difficult that resistance would become. Here is the strategic logic that makes this a trap rather than simply an offensive. When Russia pushes into Kharkiv Oblast, Ukraine faces an immediate dilemma that has no clean solution. If Ukraine reinforces its Kharkiv defenses by pulling troops from other fronts, Russia gains ground in Donbass, in Zaporizhia, in areas where its main offensive pressure has been concentrated for months. Putin himself acknowledged this dynamic when he praised the offensive going along the entire line of contact. Every kilometer Russia advances toward Kharkiv forces Ukraine to make a choice between equally bad options. Either defend Kharkiv and weaken Donbass, or hold Donbass and risk losing ground in the north. It is a trap designed by a military that learned from its own catastrophic failures in 2022 and rebuilt specifically to exploit Ukraine's most fundamental vulnerability. It is fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously with an army that is exhausted, stretched, and in constant need of ammunition that arrives slower than it is consumed. The town of Vovchansk became the symbol of this grinder in 2024. Russian forces attacked it repeatedly. They used waves of infantry to probe Ukrainian positions, pulling back, then surging again. Ukrainian defenders inside Vovchansk described fighting building by building, room by room. The town was reduced to rubble over weeks of urban combat. Russia never fully seized it. Ukraine never fully expelled the Russian attackers. The battle simply continued, consuming soldiers and resources on both sides. But Russia, with its far larger military-industrial base and willingness to absorb casualties at a rate that would be politically impossible in a democratic country, could sustain that grinder far longer than Ukraine could. And by January 2026, the North Grouping was still pressing forward, still establishing its so-called buffer zone, still advancing toward positions that would bring Russian artillery and tactical drones within range of Kharkiv city itself. The humanitarian dimension of what Russia is doing in Kharkiv Oblast is not a side effect of the military campaign. It is part of the strategy. The city of Kupiansk, the second largest railway junction in all of Kharkiv Oblast, had 90% of its infrastructure destroyed or damaged by Russian strikes by the time officials spoke publicly about its condition. 5 major rail lines converge at Kupiansk, connecting northwest toward Kharkiv city, running east toward Russian-held territory, branching south toward the broader Donbass front. Control of Kupiansk means control of logistics, of resupply routes, of the arteries through which Ukrainian forces feed the front line. Russian forces struck it with glide bombs, with artillery, with multiple launch rocket systems, and with first-person view attack drones. 2 municipal workers were killed in a single combined strike while trying to keep the city functioning. The Kupiansk City Military Administration described the situation as critical. The city that Ukrainian forces liberated in September 2022 was being methodically destroyed from a distance, its strategic value being erased before any Russian soldier needed to take it at close range. Putin explained his justification for all of this in language that had been carefully constructed to sound defensive. When asked directly about the Kharkiv operation, he pointed to Ukrainian strikes on Russian border regions, on the cities of Belgorod and Bryansk, and said civilian areas in Russia were being shelled. He said Russia was being forced to create a security zone, a buffer zone, in response. When asked whether Russia planned to capture Kharkiv city itself, he said there were no such plans as of today. That phrase, as of today, was doing significant work. It was not a commitment. It was not a guarantee. It was the language of a leader who wanted to deny current intentions while preserving every future option. Russian state media and Russian lawmakers were less restrained. One Russian general, Viktor Sobolev, said the buffer zone should stretch into 6 Ukrainian regions, including not just Kharkiv and Sumy, but Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, and Odessa in central and southern Ukraine, far from any border with Russia. The idea had metastasized well beyond its stated justification. Now, consider what all of this means for NATO. Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Chief Kaupo Rosin, speaking in February 2026, based on intelligence gathered from Russian internal discussions, said something that Western governments have struggled to process publicly. He said Putin currently has no desire to halt the invasion of Ukraine and believes he can outsmart the United States during any peace negotiations. He said Russian plans involve creating new military units and multiplying the pre-war force along NATO's eastern border by 2 to 3 times, depending on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. He said this multiplication was not happening yet, but it was being planned and prepared. Russia cannot attack NATO this year or next, Rosen assessed, but Russia is building toward a future confrontation. And the buffer zone strategy in Kharkiv and Sumy is not separate from that larger plan. It is the foundation of it. Here is why. If Russia successfully establishes a permanent military presence 15 to 20 kilometers inside Kharkiv and Sumy regions, it changes the entire strategic geography of northeastern Ukraine. Ukrainian tube artillery, which has a maximum range of roughly 30 kilometers in most configurations, would be pushed back from the border. Tactical drone strike capability would be reduced. Ukrainian early warning systems would face compression. Russian forces, operating from positions inside Ukrainian territory rather than from their own border regions, would have a stable forward platform from which to launch future operations. And NATO's eastern flank states, already watching this war with growing alarm, would be looking at a Russian military that had successfully expanded its territorial buffer and consolidated its position directly on the edge of countries they are treaty-bound to defend. The NATO response to all of this has been, in the assessment of multiple analysts and frontline officials, inadequate to the speed of events. The alliance has provided weapons, it has provided training, it has provided intelligence, it has provided financial support, but it has not provided these things at the pace or scale that matches what Russia is doing on the ground. The most critical shortage for Ukrainian air defense as of early 2026 is Patriot interceptor missiles. Russia knows this. Russian commanders have adapted their tactics to exploit it, mixing night and daytime attacks to force continuous consumption of interceptors that Ukraine cannot replace fast enough. Ukraine is now using roughly 30% more strike drones than Russia, a genuine advantage. But on the defensive side, in the air above Kharkiv, the gap between what Ukraine needs and what it has received remains dangerous. The ceasefire dimension adds another layer of complexity to the trap Putin has set. In early May 2026, a 3-day ceasefire was announced for the Victory Day holiday on May 9th. Russia and Ukraine both agreed to it following a push from United States President Donald Trump, who called it hopefully the beginning of the end of a very long, deadly, and hard-fought war. But immediately after the ceasefire announcement, Russia's defense ministry accused Ukraine of breaking it. Ukraine did not immediately respond. And analysts watching the pattern noted something significant. Russia had used previous pause periods not to de-escalate, but to resupply, to reposition, and to prepare the next phase of offensive operations. Putin's Victory Day speech itself, delivered at a parade scaled back because, as one Russian parliamentarian bluntly put it, the tanks are busy fighting and we need them on the battlefield more than on Red Square, made no concession toward any genuine peace framework. He described the war as just. He described his soldiers as confronting an aggressive force armed and supported by the entire NATO bloc. He said he firmly believed his cause was just, the vocabulary of escalation, not resolution. The Russian defense minister, Andrei Belousov, had stated at the end of 2025 that NATO had begun accelerated preparations for confrontation with Russia in the coming decade, and that this created real prerequisites for continued military action by Russia in 2026. He cast the entire war in Ukraine as part of a long-term confrontation with the alliance, not as a dispute over Ukrainian territory. From Moscow's perspective, the Kharkiv buffer zone is not about protecting Belgorod from artillery. It is about positioning Russian military power for a generational struggle with the West. And NATO, despite its rhetoric, despite its summits and its declarations and its reaffirmations of solidarity, has not yet produced an answer to a threat being constructed this methodically and this patiently. Peace negotiations, such as they have been, have illustrated rather than resolved the core problem. United States and European negotiators reached tentative agreement with Kiev on security guarantees, describing them as Article 5-like, platinum-level commitments that would underpin any peace deal. But Russia rejected them entirely. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Moscow would never accept any NATO country troops in Ukraine. A Kremlin aide said Ukraine would never regain Crimea and would never have a path to NATO membership. Russia's position, as articulated by Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov, is that Russia will accept full control over the Donbass and nothing less. Ukraine has said these demands are not a starting point for negotiation, but a capitulation. And the gap between those two positions, measured against what Russia is doing in Kharkiv right now, explains why the conflict has no near-term diplomatic resolution visible on any map of current reality. For the people of Kharkiv, all of this strategic analysis translates into something far more immediate. It translates into air raid sirens at unpredictable hours. It translates into glide bombs falling on apartment buildings and railway yards and municipal offices. It translates into convoys of civilians moving west, while columns of Ukrainian reinforcements move east. It translates into soldiers in underground positions listening to the sound of incoming artillery and calculating, in real time, whether the next round will land close enough to matter. The Kharkiv Regional Military Administration confirmed in April 2026 that Russian forces were intensifying their offensive around Vovchansk, with shelling, ground assaults, and a clear attempt to exploit vulnerabilities in Ukrainian defenses. Evacuations were underway. Ukrainian officials were urgently appealing for expedited military aid from Western allies. They warned that delays would have devastating consequences. Those are the same words, in roughly the same order, that Ukrainian officials have been using for more than 4 years. The answer from NATO capitals has been consistent in its support and insufficient in its speed. The trap that Putin has set in Kharkiv is not simply military, it is also political. Every month that the buffer zone operation continues without a decisive NATO response demonstrates something to Russia's domestic audience, to the governments of the global south watching this war, and to the alliance's own eastern members. It demonstrates that Russia can absorb sanctions, can outlast Western political will, and can expand its military footprint in Europe without triggering a response proportionate to its ambitions. Putin told his commanders in late 2025 that Russia had retained the initiative and was advancing practically on the enemy's shoulders. That is the language of a leader who believes the trap is working, that Ukraine is being stretched past the point of sustainable defense, and that NATO has not found the answer it needs to change the calculation before the map changes further. The answer NATO has not found is not simply more weapons, though weapons are necessary. It is a strategic framework that matches Russia's long-term patience with long-term commitment, that sustains Ukrainian capability, not in emergency surges, but in continuous, predictable supply chains that do not leave Patriot interceptor stockpiles depleted and artillery ammunition supplies uncertain. Estonia has been building layered defensive programs combining fortifications, surveillance systems, and short-range air defenses along its own border. Since 2026's military balance assessment made clear that Russia was planning to multiply forces along NATO's eastern flank. Finland has submitted to Parliament a proposal to allow the import and storage of nuclear weapons, a decision that would have been unthinkable before the full-scale invasion. Poland is conducting artillery exercises 100 kilometers from Kaliningrad. The eastern flank is preparing for what it sees coming. Whether the rest of the alliance is preparing at the same pace is the question whose answer matters most. Putin's move in Kharkiv is deadly because it is not a gamble. It is a calculated application of military pressure designed to exhaust, to stretch, and to demonstrate that the costs of containing Russia exceed what Western democracies are willing to pay over time. NATO has the collective military and economic power to answer it. What it has not yet demonstrated is the collective will to answer it at the scale and speed the battlefield demands. That gap between capability and will, between what NATO could do and what it has chosen to do, is the trap's true architecture. And until that gap closes, the fighting in Kharkiv will continue, the buffer zone will expand, and the answer that NATO is searching for will remain, for now, out of reach.